All right. Hi, my name is Todd Campbell. I'm at the University of Connecticut. I'm here today with Ron Michaels from the Connecticut State Department of Education. Today we're going to do a webinar focused on classroom level assessment resources, supportive of the implementation of NGSS.
And the other thing that I wanted to tell our listeners, Todd, is that this is one of several opportunities that listeners have to learn about classroom level assessments. The State Department of Education just released this year classroom interim assessments, and we will be putting out a series of webinars in the next couple of weeks on how to use those as classroom or instructional resources as well. But I'm really pleased to be here with you, Todd, at UConn. It's a beautiful day up here in Connecticut, and we are ready to talk about classroom level assessments and the implementation of NGSS in the classroom.
So Ron and I have put together a set of slides that will just help guide our discussion today. We'll start out just talking about why a focus on assessment is necessary, especially after our recent adoption of NGSS in Connecticut. So I think most people are aware already that the framework in the next generation science standards call for a pretty dramatic shift in instruction in classrooms with a practice-based experience for learners in those settings. And because of that, there's a necessity for thinking about a redesign of our assessments as well. So one of the ideas that we want to think about as we think about classroom level assessments is how we think learning happens, or how we understand learning to happen, and then creating assessments that will allow us to see how well we're supporting students to experience those types of learning.
That's well said, Todd. And in fact, I can't believe it's been 4 years in the state of Connecticut since November 2015 when our adoption occurred. This year is an important year for us in state summative testing because it's our first accountability year, but these tools are more instructional, and it really aligns to the three-dimensional aspect of NGSS and the types of pedagogy that we're hopeful that Connecticut teachers are using in their science classrooms.
So when we think about the next generation science standards, before we start talking about assessments, we want to just visit quickly with you about what these dramatic shifts of instruction are. So one of the shifts is focused on what science studies researchers would say essentially science is. So Michael Ford talks about science as essentially the construction and critique of explanations about events that happen in the world. So if that's what science is, and we want to give students an authentic representation of that in our classrooms, then we need to engage them in opportunities for constructing and critiquing their own explanations of things that they see happening. This in the NGSS is translated into three-dimensional learning, and a definition of three-dimensional learning would be engaging students in science and engineering practices to use disciplinary core ideas and cross-cutting concepts to explain phenomena or solve problems. And in that context, when I was referring to engaging students in science and engineering practices, those practices would be kind of knowledge production practices. So they might pick up a disciplinary core idea or a cross-cutting concept as something they think is useful, and they might try it out because they think it's going to help them explain some event in the world. And they may find out that that particular idea isn't useful, but those knowledge production practices will be those ways of figuring out this idea is working or it's not working, or here's some evidence that this idea is working or not.
I remember when Joe Kraychek put this quote out in 2015, we were thinking at that point that Connecticut is ahead of the curve in terms of three-dimensional science instruction. We already had a content and an inquiry strand in the last state standards in 2004 and 2008. So really what we're asking our teachers to do is use those 2 dimensions and add a third called cross-cutting concepts. If you are unfamiliar with these 3 dimensions as classroom tools, please click on some of the websites and some of the webinars that explain three-dimensional pedagogy in more depth. We're going to continue assuming that you have a good understanding of what three-dimensional classroom instruction looks like, and we'll be talking using the terms science and engineering practices, or SEPs, disciplinary core ideas, or DCIs, and cross-cutting concepts, C3.
You can hear my email going off. So if we think about this shift in instruction, it starts making us also start thinking about what curriculum might look like that would support students to learn in a three-dimensional way. And so there's a really nice piece that came out recently from Coe and Christ in Science Education, where they reference Achieve and NSTA 2014 documents, where they talk about 4 different things that are broadly construed as the kind of consensus model of what materials should embody if they're going to be supportive of three-dimensional learning. And so one of those commitments would be a driving anchoring phenomenon that sets the goal or problem space for instruction. So this would be the reason students would be engaged in the first place. So it'd be the uncertainty that would necessitate them grabbing for and using science and engineering practices and disciplinary core ideas. The second thing that would be involved would be a central model or explanatory account that's incrementally revised over time to explain the problem space. So you have a problem space, which is your phenomena, and then you have a model that you're going to refine across a unit of instruction, or you have an argument that you're going to refine across a unit of instruction, and that's going to be something that you iteratively come back to across time. The next thing, the third criteria that was articulated was the purposeful use of investigations. Those are broadly construed to incrementally build and refine the model-based account over time. So you would either think of or negotiate with your students some kinds of particular investigations that would give them some evidences to support some claims that they're going to make throughout the unit as they're refining their ideas about how to explain a phenomenon. And then the last part, the fourth core priority would be the use of discourse, evidence, and argumentation to generate claims, and supporting evidence to build and refine aspects of the explanatory account over time. So thinking about as teachers, supporting students to use discourse, to engage with each other, to make sense about things that they're not certain about, to help resolve sort of unresolved issues about the phenomenon that they're trying to explain over time.
That Coe and Christ article that just came out is a really good basis for understanding some of these key concepts for NGSS. In fact, just in these 4 bullet points, we've got some great words like phenomena, like investigation, incrementally, evidence, argumentation, supporting evidence, problem solving. This is absolutely a huge shift in the way we understand, teach, and learn science education. Both Achieve and the Coe and Christ articles are available. If you can't find it, reach out to either Todd or myself, and we can send you a copy of either.
So now we'll jump into, if that's what instruction should look like, then what implications does that have for assessment? So we first started thinking about this, or the way we even develop our own understanding about what assessments might look like is we look to what other experts nationally have said about what this kind of three-dimensional assessment might look like. So one document from the National Research Council is developing assessments for the next generation science standards. I think this was written mainly for those researchers or assessment specialists who would begin to start supporting teachers in developing assessments, but also begin to start doing the work at the even state level when you think about what the state level assessments might look like. The other National Research Council document that we look at is Seeing Students Learn Science. And this was put out and I think built from that first document. And this is for teachers. So this is to give teachers a sense of what assessment might look like and how it might be pretty different than how it's traditionally been thought of in classrooms. So in this document in particular, they give lots of case studies so you can get a sense of what learners experience and what commitments we'd have about assessment in GSS.
You know, Todd, both of these books are available for free download when you go to the NSF site, or if you just Google the titles, you'll find that you can download these for absolutely nothing, and they are wonderful, especially seeing students learn science, a great resource for classroom teachers to develop assessments.
And I would just piggyback onto that and say, like, I know some people like the books in their hands, but for myself, I like to go into these NRC PDF files, and you can do word searches and find particular things you're looking for. So within these documents, there's some commitments they've articulated, and we're just going to highlight a few of those, but it'll give you a sense of how we have been thinking about classroom level assessments and how we think others have as well, and as a way to get you started in thinking about these kinds of classroom level instruction or classroom level assessments. So the first one is instruction that is aligned with the framework in the NGSS will naturally provide many opportunities for teachers to observe and record evidence of student learning. So they're saying as students are at the task of figuring things out, there'll be plenty of opportunities and chances for you, I guess those are the same words, opportunities for you to get a sense of what students are thinking and then decide what implications that has for what you might do with them next. Like as an example, and we'll come to this, so early on you might ask students to develop an initial model of what they think is happening, or an initial hypothesis that might help explain something they see. And when they do that, that is an opportunity for you to get a sense of what they're originally thinking, and it gives you a sense of where you might go in instruction after that. Another commitment in these documents is student activities that reflect such learning include developing, refining models, generating, discussing, analyzing data, engaging in both spoken and written explanations and argumentation, and then reflecting on their own understanding. So you could see within each of these particular types of activities that students would be doing, or practices they would be doing as they engage in three-dimensional learning. It gives the teacher a chance to see kind of publicly, either hear what they express as their ideas, or see what's represented by them, either through models or just the writing that they might engage in. The last one is such opportunities are the basis for the development of assessments for three-dimensional science learning. So we need to really focus on what is it we envision science learning to be, and think about our assessments as just opportunities for us to get a sense of whether or not we're providing those kinds of learning experiences for students.
You know, Todd, as a testing specialist up in Hartford, I can tell you that we are trying to develop summative tests that mimic good classroom instructions in a three-dimensional way. So I've been saying this for 4 years now, ever since our adoption. Don't worry about the state test. Worry about good three-dimensional instruction, and the test will take care of itself. These 3 bullet points absolutely agree with that idea that good classroom or formative assessment should be three-dimensional as an instructional pedagogy. And the more that they mimic any kind of formative or formal testing, the better aligned they will all be. We're trying to write assessments now the same way that we're trying to teach our students science, in a three-dimensional way.
And that's a perfect segue to the next slide here. This is just one more of those statements from those NRC documents, and probably one of my favorites. So classroom assessment should be an integral part of instruction and should reinforce the types of science learning envisioned in the framework in NGSS. So from a student's perspective, they might just think that they're just experiencing regular instruction. They're just coming in to engage in figuring out something that they're curious about. From a teacher's perspective, we've thought behind the scenes of, we're going to give them these opportunities, and we're going to get a sense of how well they're picking up ideas that we want them to be using and practices that we want them to develop facility with. And these are just some models that we picked up images of, but you can get a sense if you see the slide where if students are engaged in explaining something with a model, you'll get a sense as the teacher of what they're thinking, and then over time how that thinking might change as you see changes in the model they're developing. The next thing we have is just some ideas of how you might think about formative assessment within your classroom that can help you guide student learning. So we're continually focusing on how do we think about student learning. So instead of thinking about how they're going to do on the assessment at the end, which we do think about, I guess, we're more importantly thinking about like what is the student learning that we are after, and how are we going to support it. And so if the student learning we're after is explaining real world events or solving problems of consequence, then we want to make sure that we're giving those students opportunities to do that, and then we're supporting them as they do it. So one way of thinking about formative assessment is we use this framework. The first 3 bullets here, particularly related to formative assessments, is anticipating and eliciting students' ideas. So before we even engage students in an activity, we think about like what do we think students are going to say? What are we going to be listening for? How might we understand what we think they're going to say? And then what implications does that have? The next one is evaluating students' ideas. So once we hear ideas, trying to get a sense of what those ideas are telling us, trying to really dig into what students are saying and how what they're saying might be the stepping stones that we can build knowledge on top of. So we want to move away from kind of deficitly looking for the wrong parts of students' ideas toward looking for kind of assets that might be building blocks for building more sophisticated explanations. And then the third bullet is crafting next steps in instruction that account for students' ideas and support student learning. So those first 2 are anticipate what students are might say, evaluate what you heard, and then think about what you can do now with what you heard as a teacher. So those are ways that we think about formative assessment throughout the unit, throughout a unit of instruction. And then another classroom level assessment is the fourth and fifth bullet. One of the things we target, we use a lot of model-based instruction in our work, and so we think of models as the sense-making practices that help students get to an evidence-based explanation. But the target of what we're after in the unit is an evidence-based explanation of that anchoring event that started our unit and that we keep coming back to, which was one of our principles earlier. And then once we support, and I'll give you some sense of how we do that, but once we support students over time with summary tables and gotta have lists and activities over time to develop these evidence-based explanations at the end of a unit, we can also think about whether or not we want to engage students in thinking about a related phenomenon or scenario or 3-dimensional assessment that asks them to think about something that's related but not exactly the same thing that they experienced in the unit. So this would give us just a chance to say we think learning is the ability to pick up disciplinary core ideas and practices across a range of contexts, and this would give us a different context that we could get a sense of how well students were able to reason with the ideas that they've learned in an instructional unit. And then some examples of those are what Achieve's recently released, which I'm going to let Ron tell us about because I don't remember what TAP stands for, and he does. And then there's some CSD interim assessments that can also be used, and I'll let Ron talk about those as well.
So TAPS stands for Task Annotation Project in Science, and it was just released, well, a few weeks ago by Achieve. If you go to their website, it's very good examples of 3-dimensional instruction and what I would consider to be pretty good exemplars of a 3-dimensional design, curricular design in a typical science classroom by using an anchoring phenomena and then creating a 3-dimensional flow of model and sense making, arguing with evidence, problem solving, all of the cross-cutting concept skills that are necessary for good NGSS instruction. The other example that we have listed is the State Department of Education interim assessments. And again, at some point, look for some innovative uses of the interim assessments as a classroom instructional tool that myself and some of my State Department of Ed colleagues, Jeff Gregg and Christy Alberino, will put out on our YouTube page. They are very useful as good examples of starting with a stimulus and then some type of simulation or some type of model or some type of crafting of answers through graphing or user interface. And it really does mimic good three-dimensional instructional tactics and techniques in a very neat package. So these are just two of many examples that if you or do some research online that you'll be able to find. But right here in the state of Connecticut, we've got these two that are easily accessed.
All right, so the next slide, we start to look at where can we find opportunities for formative assessments within a unit of instruction. And early on, when we looked at some of the guidance from those NGSS and assessment NRC documents, it talked about how if you're doing three-dimensional instruction with your students in the classrooms, you're going to find lots of opportunities to see what they're thinking, to decide how you will move in a direction that might be supportive of their learning based on what they're thinking. So we just outlined a few bullets here of where within a unit of instruction you might find opportunities to see what students know and to help build on what they know. So some of these places are initial observations, questions, and models of phenomena. So early on in the unit, you might see them making some initial observations, asking some questions, developing initial models, and all those are opportunities for you to see how they're thinking about and how they're pulling in their own resources from their lives outside of school. Another opportunity or other opportunities would be in small group and whole class discussions. So if you're getting the opportunity as a teacher to walk around and listen to students, I think advice from the Ambitious Science Teaching book talks about, the first thing you maybe want to do when you come up to a small group is just listen, see what kind of ideas you hear students talking about and working with. And then from that, think about whether or not you've developed previously maybe some back pocket questions that can help them connect what they're talking about to the anchoring phenomenon or some disciplinary ideas that might be important for helping them think about the phenomenon. And that can also happen in whole class discussions. So any of these are opportunities for you to hear students' ideas. And anytime you hear those ideas, that's an opportunity for formative assessment. Connected to whole class discussions is in the Ambitious Science Teaching framework or one of the high leverage practices within Ambitious Science Teaching. I don't guess it's a high leverage practice, might be a subset of practices, is the summary table. So using a face-to-face tool like a summary table at the end of a lesson to help students in the class come to consensus on what they experienced and why that matters, kind of what the patterns they observed were, how they explain those patterns, and how that what they've used to explain those patterns helps them think about the anchoring phenomenon of the unit. So, but again, as you're listening to students negotiate what might go on a row of the summary table, you're getting a chance to hear how they're thinking about whatever you did with them for the day. And that gives you a chance to think about okay, do I need to come back and revisit something that we worked on today with another maybe learning experience? Or are we ready to move on and look at another idea that's going to be important for explaining the phenomenon? Another opportunity is revisiting group models. So when students midway through a unit come back with sticky notes and decide that they're going to need to make some changes based on what they've learned over the previous couple of lessons, that's an opportunity again for you to see their ideas and how they're thinking and how they're coordinating those ideas with the evidences they've been gathering. Another one is public representations. I think that is summary tables, but it's also got to have lists. So as students negotiate things that they think need to be in their evidence-based explanation, those can change over time, and whatever you see on those got to have lists, those are the things that students are currently working with. And what you don't see are the things that they're not yet working with that you might think are important. So it gives you opportunities to think about, like, how do I put an idea on the table that's not there that might be really important for them to move past something they've been struggling with. And then the last part is this evidence-based explanation. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about that. I think we will. This is where you get a chance. We do at the very end of the unit, after we do group consensus models, we ask students to develop evidence-based explanations. And these are done individually, so they can take these home, but they come back with them. And we ask them to like create a story that tells us a coherent story that tells us what's going on in this event that's happening in the world, and how's it connected to the ideas we've been learning about, or how those ideas connected to helping explain it, and then what evidences over time have we gathered that would help us explain it as well.
You know, I've been in many, many science classrooms in the last 4 years since our adoption, and one of the first things that science teachers seem to always ask me is, where can I find formative assessment? There's so many different places. These 6 bullets are just some of them, and teachers are literally limited only by their imagination and creativity as to where to find good formative assessments within a three-dimensional design. We are going to talk a little bit more about evidence-based explanations and using evidence-based explanations as a formative assessment tool.
So the next slide we have is just some criteria or aspects of evidence-based explanations that we try to focus on and emphasize with pre-service teachers, but also with students in classrooms. So these, like I said earlier, we think about models as the sense-making tools. Those are the things that help us get to evidence-based explanations. If our learning hasn't progressed through engaging in the sense-making practice of modeling, it may not have been a practice, or it wasn't a practice. So if the act of having students sit down together in a group and try to represent how they're thinking and argue back and forth about what does and doesn't belong in that representation, over time can help them clarify their own thinking. And that whole process is to help them get to this explanation of this real world event. So for us, the evidence-based explanations are the target of the unit, but there are also opportunities, again, for us to assess or to create a classroom level assessment that lets us know, how well our support how well what we provided as supports has fostered learning throughout the unit. So when we think about an evidence-based explanation, there's 3 different things that we're looking at and we try to emphasize with learners. One is the story of what happened. So we want to know what happened with this event that happened in the world. It's a very specific thing, and we want them to tell us what they think happened with it. We want them to think about important science ideas necessary to explain mechanistically what happened. So we not only want them to tell us what they see happening or observing, but we want them to tell us the why or how that's happening. So sometimes this is the unseen events. Examples we have here are subduction, convection currents. I think the particulate nature of matter is another good example. All those are things that happen and may not be visible, but they provide explanatory power that allows you to explain this event that we're focused on in the unit, but also other events as well. And then the third part is we also want them to think about the evidence that they have that allows them to make claims about the application of those science ideas. So how do you know that this particular idea is, if it's not visible, how do you know it's actually causing something to happen? And so we ask students to point to lab activities or investigations they did, and particularly to evidences that they can use to support some kind of claim they're going to make within their evidence-based explanation. And then the last thing I'll say is, particularly the last part, we've even used sentence stems there. So within the middle of a paragraph evidence-based explanation, we might ask them to say, we know this because, especially at the end, if you make a claim, you should follow that up with a sentence that starts with, we know this because, and you could say something like, because when we did the crushing can experiment in the middle of the unit, we found out that water, if it didn't have water in it, the can didn't crush. Like, that's a pretty specific piece of evidence they can point to make a claim. And then the next thing we use when we think about evidence-based explanations, especially in the classroom, is an assessment or a rubric that we can use to give students some feedback on how well their explanation helps explain the event that we were after in the first place. And this is one that we've been working on. It was developed by some resources from the Research Practice Collaboratory. It's not here, but it's linked, or the reference is linked to our website. We developed the model-based inquiry website that I think I have at the end. If not, I can share. The next thing we have is as we talked about the different kinds of classroom level assessments, we talked about those formative assessments that happen across the unit. We talked about the evidence-based explanation that is the kind of culmination of a unit. And then the other thing we talked about is these other assessments that you might bring in that are based on a related scenario or prompt, and it gives students an opportunity to use the disciplinary core ideas or practices in a different context to see how well they're able to move those ideas across different contexts. So some ways of understanding these types of assessments, you can gain understanding of this by the new TAPS resources from Achieve. They have some elementary, middle, and high school. What I really love about these is they are the humble attempts of teachers to make these kinds of assessments. And then there's some annotation that's happened by the experts with assessment with Achieve. These are teachers who have spent a lot of time thinking about assessment. So they provide some annotation that says this is how this particular part of the assessment really does a nice job of capturing the intent of NGSS or three-dimensional assessments, and this is how it might fall a little bit short. If I go ahead and go to the next slide, and when this annotation happens, there's particular things that those who did the annotation at Achieve, the teachers they worked with, look for, and I really like some of these are equity, so they're thinking about like how equitable are the scenarios for allowing students to bring in the resources that they might have from their communities and connect them to the science learning they're engaged in. They're focused on the scenario. What kind of scenario is provided and how accessible is that scenario to a broader range of students. And then you can see the 3 dimensions, SEPs, DCIs, and CCCs. And they also focus on to what extent are learners getting opportunities to engage in sense making within these tasks that are provided kind of at the end of a unit before another unit of instruction might start. So you want to talk briefly about that?
Yeah, so I was going to say, Todd, that I like the fact that these are teacher generated, and it usually follows a storyline that either starts with a phenomena or a task, and there's nothing perfect about these, but these are very good examples of what a good storyline includes, which includes a science and engineering practice, the content or the performance expectation built in, and a cross-cutting concept or two, and it's bundled all together in a learning unit called a storyline.
And then we have just a few more, this came from a recent blog as these TAPS resources were released that really resonated with me, especially thinking about those the NRC guidance for assessment. So I'll just read through a few of these. When you think about assessments in NGSS, they should intentionally blur some lines between instruction and assessment and between school and the real world. So giving students a chance just to engage in thinking about something that might matter or be of consequence. Give students the opportunity to address something that matters, I just said that, or ask students to show how they are thinking about something, not just that they know particular fact. So how are they thinking about something in ways that are connected and, like Ron said, are part of a storyline of how something happened. Another example, and this is, I think we could actually send some of these in to Achieve to be annotated for the TAPS project. These are some tasks that we've developed at UConn, but we're using STEM teaching tool resources to develop these tasks. And we've got a template that we've developed from their resources that can help you with that. And this particular task, just as an example, it was at the end, students had developed a well fall unit. So it was what kinds of resources might a whale who's died and fallen to the bottom of the ocean provide for the ecosystem. And the assessment is because it's after the unit and it's a related phenomenon, it's about forest fires. So the extent to which a forest fire might provide or take away resources for that natural environment. And so that's paired with, it starts out with a scenario like Ron talked about before. It identifies a particular practice that students will be engaging in if they're doing the assessment. And then it provides some data perhaps that they can look at, and maybe a support here, a carbon cycle that they can reference, and then ask them to make an argument. So use the graph, describe the patterns of evidence science could use to support or refute each claim, the claim that the forest fire is really damaging the environment or the forest fire is really helping the environment. So these are what's really nice about these assessments. I'm going to go to the next slide. And our template here is it's built out of, like I said, the STEM teaching tool, so we definitely need to give them credit. But in this, it asks you, or it supports you in developing an assessment by asking you what is it you want to be able to say your students are able to do, and once you say that, then what are the disciplinary core ideas, science and engineering practice, cross-cutting concepts you want to assess. And then for each of those, you would write some kind of scenario that would allow you to get close to those disciplinary core ideas, or be an instantiation of the disciplinary core idea being used. And then from the STEM teaching tools, there's stems in there for each of the practices. So for science and engineering practices, they have a stem for each of the practices, or multiple stems that you could pick up and use to develop an assessment item. So these kinds of assessment, I think, like Ron mentioned, would start out with a scenario, just almost like a unit would start out with an anchoring phenomenon, and then they would be followed up by 2 to 3 or 4 different assessment questions. And these questions would be aligned to either a cross-cutting concept in the DCI, or cross-cutting, or I'm sorry, the science and engineering practice in the DCI. And over the breadth of the 3 or 4 items in the scenario, you'd have a 3D assessment. So you might not have 3D in each individual item, but the collection of the items would represent a three-dimensional assessment. And then the very last slide we have is just some resources. So we do have an assessment design template. It's at our secondary science modules website. I believe there's a link to it within the slides. If you go to that, you can find the template, but you could also find, we have about 20 assessments that students, pre-service teachers have built connected to units that you can pick up. They're humble attempts to build three-dimensional assessments. And then over on the right side here on the slide is our model-based inquiry unit development template. There's a lot of resources there for thinking about three-dimensional learning, but there's also the evidence-based explanation rubric that we talked about, and more information about how we think about those evidence-based explanations.
Well, that sounds pretty good, Todd. I know you're going to have questions about this. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We probably should have included a slide with our emails on it, but I'll give it to you verbally. I can be reached at ronald.michaels@ct.gov, and Todd can be reached at todd.campbell@uconn.edu. Thanks for listening. We hope that you've enjoyed the last 40 minutes or so talking about classroom level assessments and resources supportive of implementation of NGSS in Connecticut classrooms across the state. We will try and put together more webinars like this, and just keep an eye out on the UConn website and in the State Department of Education website for more webinars that we hope you find useful. So thank you from the University of Connecticut, from Todd Campbell and Ron Michaels. We wish you a good day.